Hello there, welcome to the channel. Sometimes when Starfleet would develop a new class of ship, it'd be a huge hit. It'd be fanfare, there'd be all kinds of accolades and pats on the backs and people saying, "You've done a great job." That was the case with the Galaxy class Starship. But the Galaxy class vessel was the culmination of decades of work, centuries of development, and input from many individuals. But it also spawned a series of other starships built in the same vein, much as the Constitution class starship had done previously. We saw as the Constitution era vessels gave way to the era of the Excelsior class, and later the ship designs began to evolve, and we started to see more of a move from that more antiquated 23rd century design to the more sleek 24th century designs, like the Ambassador class, were the precursors of this particular form. But particularly with the Galaxy class, we saw it spawn a number of copies, various other classes of starship that had strikingly similar hull configurations or components. Clearly, they were built in the same vein of this highly successful design. Some of them came earlier, some of them came later, but today we're looking at the Niagara class starship, a three-nacelled vessel as part of the Project Galaxy line. This was a smaller ship than the Galaxy class vessel, but no less important in the grand scheme of things within the Federation. Yes, it was not from the front line, great luxury liner vessels of exploration from the golden age of exploration within the Federation, but it was certainly part of it. It was one of the premier vessels, which was, in a sense, it was a follow-up ship to the Galaxy. Now, although we don't know how many of them were built, as we know, not many Galaxy class starships were actually built and commissioned into service prior to the Dominion War. The Niagara class certainly was one that was probably far more common as a follow-up starship, as we see with like what you might call the second contact fleet, like ships like the Cerritos. The Niagara was not part of that vein, but it was certainly part of the vein of starships that went out, went forth, and followed up the missions from the Galaxy class, but was sort of probably riding their cost based on the sheer size and volume of the vessel. Onto that, the basics of this ship. We know of only one truly named vessel, the USS Princeton, but there may have been another one that was named known as the USS Wellington, although it's unclear if that actually truly was a Niagara class starship. But let's go with the USS Princeton. The Princeton was destroyed at the Battle of Wolf 359, where the vessel failed to make a significant impression on the Borg Q, but that was thanks to the Borg assimilating the tactical data and, quite frankly, Starfleet not being ready. Now, I've previously made a lot of noise about Starfleet's ill preparedness for dealing with the Borg, but quite frankly, how were they supposed to know the Borg existed? I mean, there were rumors and stories and legends. Certainly, Starfleet had some inclination that the Borg were out there, but perhaps not enough information to really think to themselves it wasn't something they could handle, much like the Romulans or the Klingons or the Cardassians, who they'd handled before. The Borg were just another race, right? So yes, Starfleet wasn't prepared for the Borg. It was not prepared for Wolf 359, but it could have done better if not for the Borg assimilating the knowledge of Captain Jean-Luc Picard prior to the battle and given a bit more time to prepare. As we know at this time, they were updating and upgrading much of the fleet technology, tactics, and strategies. See, there's more to it. It's all great saying, oh, the Defiant class was coming. There's more to it than simply building a few more powerful ships. Starfleet had to completely overhaul the entire infrastructure of its navy and fleet operation capabilities, not to mention training. Remember, again, we are coming out of the golden age of exploration, which the Niagara class was part of. And this was an era where Starfleet was sitting at the top of the pyramid, unchallenged, almost godlike. And there was nothing they hadn't been able to handle, even with only a basic level of tactical sense. But Starfleet relied on its superior technology, numbers, political weight, economic strength, rather than sheer brute military force, often willing to sacrifice a few ships to win a single battle or war, or quite frankly, not preparing itself for the real horrors of frontline war. But as Cisco would put it, it's easy to be a saint in paradise, and Earth is paradise. All the problems haven't been solved yet out on the borders. The Galaxy-class ship was a culmination of that arrogance, and the Niagara class was also part of it. Now, the Niagara class, though, let's get back to the ship we're actually meant to be talking about. As I said, it's part of the Galaxy line. There were many other ships that fell under this umbrella, such as the Freedom class starship, the New Orleans class starships, and again the Niagara class starship. These vessels used basic pointers, shall we say, from the Galaxy class ship design. The Nebula class is probably the most egregious, as it's basically the same ship, just reconfigured. But the Niagara class used the same hull engineering principles, but wasn't actually built from the exact same components. Certainly, you look at the metallurgical structure of the ship being very similar. So I can imagine hull strength based on the number of windows and other things on the vessel. It's probably going to have a similar hull density and strength. It'll probably be built from the same grade of titanium. It had 3 nacelles, which typically in Starfleet means dreadnought. Not in this case. The Niagara class had that extra nacelle for a bit of extra power and speed for a vessel of its size. Basically, it was the diesel ship rather than the high-speed petrol, but it was there for some girth to have that third nacelle. And that it created a stronger warp bubble. But it also had to sacrifice a lot of things for that strength. For example, it wouldn't have the same sort of massive, overwhelming power reserves that a Galaxy class starship would have, because it would have a smaller reactor but powering this immensely enhanced warp field. So the vessel would be very quick with a maximum speed of warp 9.6, the same as a Galaxy class ship, but remember this vessel is much smaller. And I'm only going to assume, this is an assumption, that it was probably capable of sustaining that speed for perhaps a little longer than a Galaxy class. And bear in mind, the Galaxy class is going out and exploring deep space. It's not necessarily in a hurry to get there. The point of it is explore and take a look. The Niagara class might have been more of a rapid response vessel. In terms of other capabilities, the vessel had a crew of 530, was 546 meters in length, again about 100 meters smaller than a Galaxy class starship, but very similar configuration, especially those nacelles, which look disproportionately large, indicating to me that the vessel had the same nacelles as a Galaxy class, but the hull was smaller. Again, would have required a huge amount of power from such a smaller ship to power them. It would also be noted the vessel having a substantially smaller crew than a Galaxy class starship, indicating less internal volume or less of a requirement for such a diverse field crew. These ships probably filled a very specific niche, which again, based on available information, was likely follow-up missions right after the Galaxy class starships. They were equipped with 10 phaser arrays and, although not stated, very likely also carried photon torpedoes. It's unlikely they carried any additional armaments, and I don't believe these were a tactical vessel because, again, before the Defiant class there weren't any. Not true. The Freedom class was close, being a type of frigate, but the Niagara class was not. Based on naming conventions, general hull appearance, again, the third nacelle generally implies that these ships would have been a tactically orientated vessel, as previously Starfleet put a third nacelle on a dreadnought type, but that is not the case here. The Galaxy X variant of the Galaxy class had a third nacelle. The dreadnought class, or Federation class, whatever you want to call it, of the 23rd century had a third nacelle. All of these had that because they were a combat-orientated vessel that needed the extra power, but this ship needed it for basically propulsion and getting around. Again, this vessel will participate, specifically versus Princeton, at the Battle of Wolf 359, where it will be destroyed by the Cube and will be later encountered by the USS Enterprise D in the Starship graveyard of vessels in the aftermath of that battle, where there were very few survivors, and the few that were probably were assimilated. Of course, there were a few survivors, such as Captain Sisko as a good example, and a few other individuals who we knew would survive and be later encountered, who would hold a little bit of a resentment towards Picard. We all know who we're talking about. Anyway, that is effectively all that we know about the Niagara class starship in Alpha Canon. In Beta Canon, of course, we see much more of it. In Beta Canon, and to a degree I would say in Alpha Canon, so I would take this actually as Alpha Canon, even though it's really only in Beta that we see it. After Wolf 359, Starfleet, in the build-up to this, had already begun to realize the limitations of the Galaxy-class line of starships. Being much more scientifically orientated, it put limitations on the vessels that were basically unacceptable in future combat scenarios. These vessels couldn't really be upgraded to be combat vessels. They weren't built for it. The crews weren't trained for it. Starfleet, as I said, would have to overhaul everything from the ground up. We get groups like Red Squad starting to emerge from Starfleet Academy. We start to get ships like the Steamrunner class, Sabre class, Norway class, Akira class, Defiant class, Sovereign class, vessels that have a greater tactical versatility than their prior vessels, sacrificing, especially in cases of the Defiance and Sabre classes, they sacrifice huge amounts of their scientific and research capabilities in order to become the core of a Federation battle fleet, which they actually managed to accomplish very effectively. But again, it's more than that. It's communications, response times, supports, and logistics, things that shouldn't be forgotten, but those are things the Federation was actually really, really, really good at. Supply and resupply, repair and maintenance, these were things actually Starfleet was absolutely outstanding at doing. Unfortunately, they weren't good at actually fighting. As we should remember, the Starfleet Marines were a very small organization. It may have expanded after this, but it was still small. The MACOs had been disbanded many years earlier, and although other organizations within Starfleet, such as the Andorian Imperial Guard, still existed and were perhaps a little more tactically orientated, these were little more than planetary defense forces by the 24th century. The Golden Age peace and scientific exploration had taken its toll on the Federation's tactical capabilities, as we would very much see in their engagements with the Borg, the Sonad, the Dominion, and others on occasion. Starfleet would often get its butt handed to it on a silver platter, and only really survive it through the sheer weight of numbers that they had on their side. Trillions of population, thousands of ships, and a vast infrastructure support system. But this all had to be massively overhauled in order to meet the demands of a tactically geared up Federation, which was something I should point out that the Federation's enemies should have not underestimated. You don't poke the dragon. Starfleet was quite content to just carry on as normal. And the Romulans and Klingons kind of knew, don't provoke them, because you provoke them, this is what happens. You get the Defiant, you get the Prometheus. But if you didn't provoke them, you got ships like the Niagara. Unfortunately, the Borg and others provoked them. So these ships in Beta Canon, as I said, probably into Alpha Canon, were phased out. These ships were not destroyed. Probably very many of them were destroyed during the Dominion War because they would have been likely reactivated. But these ships began to quickly be phased out, along with the New Orleans class and other starships of this vein of Galaxy class, including the Galaxy class starships as well, to be replaced by a sort of more streamlined, more tactically orientated fleet. There was still a place for scientific vessels. I actually believe it would be a huge mistake for Starfleet to completely arm up and become like the Romulans or the Klingons. That's not who the Federation is. That's not who Starfleet is. But having a tactical core, a flying wing of combat vessels, to be a bulwark against the darkness was a very good idea. And these ships were representative of a time long gone, where Starfleet and the Federation, in its naivete, believed it could handle everything with a treaty, and believed that they could handle everything that the universe threw at them, even though they weren't even trying. The Niagara class, although was a very competent vessel of exploration, it was part of the Galaxy class fleet, which I can only imagine meant that it was a state-of-the-art ship. It was definitely a 24th century build, although we don't know exactly when it was commissioned. I hesitate to say that this vessel was definitely developed before the Galaxy class, but I would say as the Galaxy class, as part of the Project Galaxy, was a culmination of years of research and development, I would say vessels like the New Orleans class and the Niagara class were test beds for the technology that would go into the ship. As we know, vessels such as the USS Pegasus and other ships were also used as. Much of their technology was tested on these older ships for the Galaxy class, and then all of its variants spill out from there, like the Nebula class and the Niagara class. But I would say the Niagara feels like an older ship, just like the New Orleans and other vessels. They're a bit smaller, and they seem to fill this niche role that seems very suited to coming up behind the Galaxy class after it's done first contact and made the treaties. So, although I hesitate to say with confidence that it was absolutely developed before it, in Beta Canon it is, but Beta Canon isn't Alpha Canon, and I like to stick to Alpha Canon. So I would, although I hesitate to say it, I would say in this case, without information directly contradicting it in Alpha Canon, this ship was almost certainly developed as part of the development process which culminated in the Galaxy-class starship, rather than the Galaxy-class vessel was developed and then Starfleet thought, all this new technology, let's build a few new ships, which I think they did, but I think the Niagara was probably an older ship. The Galaxy-class, for example, was developed in the 2350s. This ship, I would say, probably early 2350s, 2340s. We can see early shades of the Galaxy class sort of design elements in things like the Ambassador class, which is early 24th century from the Lost era, but soon to be not so lost era with the Section 31 movie coming out. But this ship, I would say, is from that period. I'd say it's lost era Starship. But that is only my hypothesis. Let me know if you disagree, if you think the Galaxy came first and then all these other ships kind of spun off from it because they thought that's great technology, and things like the New Orleans class vessels actually were developed after it. Which then brings into question as well, we know the USS Enterprise D was not the first Galaxy class starship, because of course the USS Galaxy was. But does that mean that these ships were technologically more advanced because they would have access to the new technologies than the Enterprise D, which would actually make the Enterprise D less advanced than these ships, only marginally, very marginally, and with upgrades it's certainly going to stay at the top of the line. But are we really saying that? But yeah, I could be wrong, so let me know in the comment section down below, and please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this content. And I know this has been a bit rambly and I have gone a little off topic from the Niagara class, but quite frankly, as I like to stick to alpha canon, I was expecting there to be a little bit more, but I kind of searched, I even had to look this up, and there really isn't that much alpha. The beta canon is more extensive, but I don't cover beta canon, so let's do a little bit of out of universe. This ship was, of course, developed for the graveyard scene at Battle of Wolf 359. 359 was originally meant to be a big on-screen battle. The Best of Both Worlds, parts 1 and 2, were actually meant to be parts 1, 2, and 3, were even considered to be a movie at one point. And they had this idea of doing this big battle set piece. Now, we only got glimpses of it, and I really wish we'd seen more of it. So when they realized that's all they were going to do, they kind of went out and they bought models. Literally, by the way, that's what they did. They bought the models, they didn't make them, and then they kit bashed it. That's where it comes from. Because this was back in the day where it wasn't so easy to just create a CGI element. They had to make a physical model and film it. So that's exactly what they did. They went out, they filmed models that they made, but they would build these models and then they deliberately damage them. And the Niagara class was one of the many ships they developed for this purpose. That's how we get this fleet of Galaxy class variants, because they actually used Galaxy class model kits. And then just say they used forced perspective to make them look different sizes. Of course, they used familiar Starship classes as well, like the Excelsior class at Wolf 359. But generally, you get things like the Freedom, the New Orleans, and the Niagara class starships all participating with Wolf 359. To save money, they took the kits for the Galaxy class and they pulled them apart, stuck bits on them, like with the New Orleans class quite famously. They stuck highlighter pens on it and painted them to make it look like add-ons. And then they stuck an extra nacelle on the Niagara class. They kind of bulk it up a little bit, repaint it, change the windows, things like that. Very, very simplistic changes, but it makes sense for the continuity within the universe. And of course, this was all then burnt up and damaged to make it look like battle damage from being destroyed by Borg, which is the out-of-universe origins of this Starship class. But again, we're now at the end of this video. Thank you for watching. If you made it all to the end of the video, I hope you enjoyed it, and bye-bye.